Welcome. Again, welcome. Welcome to our series on gender washing in leadership, power, policies, and politics. My name is Dionne Rosser-Mims, and it's certainly a pleasure to be here with each of you. We're excited to share an important topic today, and really frankly, for me, an exciting moment for our women in leadership member community. We're launching and have already launched one of our first books out of our series. So again, we welcome each of you. So we've got an exciting panel of my colleagues here today. And so I will take a moment to introduce them in just a minute. As people are coming into the room again, we invite you to introduce yourself in the chat and indicate where you are in the world and where you're zooming from, and why have you joined this webinar. I, again, am Dionne Rosser-Mims, and I'm moderating today's webinar. There are a couple of logistical pieces of information we'd like to share with you as we move forward. First, your comments and questions are welcome. Please use the chat function to share your comments as they arise. However, we ask that you use the Q&A period to post your questions to our presenters after their presentation and panel discussion. Our goal is to keep this lighthearted and informal. There will be a component of our webinar where our esteemed panelists will provide some remarks, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A. So again, if you would hold your questions for the Q&A portion and to post those in the chat box. The webinar today is being sponsored by ILA's Women in Leadership member community. The colleagues who are listed here, and they will be introduced in a moment. Each of my colleagues are proud members of the Women in Leadership member community. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's panelists who, along with myself, as I've mentioned previously, are proud members of the ILA's Women in Leadership member community. All four presenters are either current or past members of the executive leadership team. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Rita Gardiner, past president of the Women in Leadership member community. She is also an associate professor of critical policy, equity, leadership studies at Western University in Canada. Dr. Wendy Fox-Kirk, visiting lecturer of Birmingham Business School of the University of Birmingham, UK. Dr. Carole J. Elliott, professor of leadership development, the University of St. Andrews of UK. And then finally, Valerie Stead, professor emerita of the Department of Entrepreneurship and Strategy at Lancaster University, Management School of the UK. I'd like to open the floor by calling on Wendy to talk to us about what is gender washing and why is this term important?
Okay, hi, thank you, Dionne. Hello, everyone. So gender washing, first of all, I need to say and give kudos to the person who came up with the term, who's a woman called Martha Burke. She came up with the term in 2011, but she didn't create a definition of it and she didn't develop theory around it, which is what we wanted to do. She came up with the term because she was reporting on and looking at what was happening at the time with Walmart. And Walmart had a class action case against it. 1.5 million of its associates, I hate that word, workers, women workers, had brought a class action suit for discrimination because they were being overlooked for pay and promotion, whereas men were moving up through the organization. So there's clear bias and discrimination. At the same time, they launched their Global Women's Economic Empowerment Initiative. Doesn't that sound fancy? And that was aimed at doing all sorts of things with women and women businesses and women suppliers. So 1.5 million women saying I'm being discriminated against, lots of evidence. You'd think they'd win. No, they didn't win. They didn't win in court. And they didn't win in court because Walmart won, because the argument was, well, they're doing things for women in other countries. So there was deemed to be not a pattern, a consistent pattern of discrimination and bias. And so they were doing things in European countries where the law means you have to, with women, and they were showcasing that. And so they were espousing one thing, putting the shop window of one thing. Look how marvelous we are in terms of we're doing these great things for women. Whereas the reality for the women in their organizations was they were still at the bottom. They were overlooked for pay. They were not rewarded, short-term contracts. We all know that stuff as women. We've all been there. So she said, well, this is like greenwashing. That's where she got it from. This is like greenwashing, only for gender. And we had seen this as scholars, the women here on the panel, and then other scholars who wrote the original paper, Genderwashing, the Myth of Equality, with us. We had noticed it in our workplace. We'd seen this happening. You know, leadership for women programs. The Ernst & Young one was a very famous one where they were doing leadership for women programs while not promoting women. So we'd seen this going on, this disjunct, this difference between what was the espoused activity and the lived experiences. And we'd seen this with our students as well, students who go out on placement, who are in workplaces while they're doing their degree. We're reporting this. It's worse as well if you're a woman of color. Okay, so we have to remember that intersectional piece. This is not just about white women, and it's not just about gender also, which is, we'll come on to that later with the book. It's also around other marginalized communities. So we decided we need a definition, because if you have a good definition, it means people can go out and do serious research, proper research, and we can gather evidence. We can shine a light on this terrible practice. So we created this definition, which says that gender washing is a process. Okay, it's an organizational process whereby organizational rhetoric, that is the talk, the texts, the policies, all the things that are rhetoric within about equality in the organization, differs from the lived experiences of the marginalized workers in that organization. And this creates a myth of gender equality. The organization's leadership can go and say how wonderful they are. In fact, some of them even win awards for being great places for inclusivity when they're not. So that creates a myth of gender equality, while individuals in the organization continue to have the same old, persistent gender discrimination. And we argue that discrimination is due to organizational structure, cultural practices, such as policies, procedures, and norms. And if you look at I'm not going to go into the theory, but the theory focuses on the structural elements, that society structures are biased. So gender washing is just a symptom. It's not a cause. It's a tool that leaders who want to maintain the status quo continue to use. If you want to know more about the theory, please, you'll see in the links, go to our original paper, Genderwashing, the Myth of Equality. So why is this important? Well, it's important because there's a little bit of sleight of hand going on here. Leaders of organizations who don't want to make those changes, their focus is on economic growth, efficiency, all those things that capitalism at the extreme end adores. And actually paying women less, paying Black people less, paying people with disabilities less plays into that. It's useful, okay? It's just as simple as that. And so they'll, while they're arguing in favor of that and still continuing to discriminate, it's harder for us to argue and speak up. Because look, we've got a women's leadership program. Look, we've even got a Black women's leadership program. What are you talking about? Aren't we wonderful? Okay, so what it does is it serves to silence resistance. It stops us speaking up. We speak up, we get blamed, which is something, if you do some reading in the literature around tokenism and around discrimination, that blaming happens all the time. It's women's fault, or it's Black people's fault. They don't work hard enough. They're not educated enough. And so it feeds into that rather than questioning it. So we created this definition. We created some theory because we wanted to begin to open up and illuminate these processes, not just around women, but around other marginalized communities. Has that answered your question, Dionne, or is there something else?
Yes, thank you so much, Wendy. So after hearing Wendy's remarks, I'd like to turn the floor over to Rita to share a little bit about how the book was conceptualized and its structure, and why is this book unique from the array of books that are out there on women in leadership.
Thank you, Dionne, and thank you, Wendy, for that introduction. So I'll come to the uniqueness. That's a kind of difficult question to answer, Dionne, so great that you gave it to me. But anyway, the book. We wanted this book to be a rich research primer into the topic of gender washing in leadership. And we're focusing on politics, policies, and power. We were really delighted that we had chapter authors who came from different countries. There's 6 different countries here, different cultures, and they all added a richness. And given that this is a book under ILA, makes sense to have that international component. So each of the authors in this book take up the concept of gender washing in a new way, adding richness to the scholarship. We have chapters on issues like gender in sport that Carole will talk about, gender in the military, girl power and corporate marketing, as well as many chapters examining organizational issues as they relate to gender practices in higher education, which Valerie will talk more about, and elsewhere. And what emerges is the different ways in which moving towards equity is such a difficult task, not only because of bureaucratic structures, but also because of individual resistance that hamper efforts to effect change and social justice. Another strength of this volume is the diverse theoretical and methodological contributions to the nascent theory of gender washing. And perhaps this is the uniqueness to answer your question, Dionne, because we have people who talk about gender washing from the issue of feminist phenomenology, which is close to my heart, from memory work, through collaborative feminist policy analysis, and through intersectionality. And as Wendy mentioned, while the focus of this book is on gender, it is our intention to look at some of the underlying mechanisms that shore up bias and discrimination in organizations and in society. The book is divided into 3 sections. And if we could have the next slide, please, Shelley. So in the first section, that section deals with effective embodied experiences, right? Simply put, the way that we can feel, right? How certain things in organizations can make us feel sad, can make us feel angry. And this is the first 4 chapters. The second part of the book looks at the ways in which organizational norms serve to shore up hierarchies. And the final part of the book examines gender washing from a diversity of cultural contexts. That thinking about gender washing in different cultural spaces is another strength of this book, and perhaps another unique quality. One of the things that some people look at is policy, and specifically policy implementation. As Wendy kind of gestured towards, oftentimes we have these wonderful policies that are brought in, but there is a gap between the policy and the implementation. How people feel on the ground can be very different to what is perceived within the rhetoric of any policy. We see how patriarchal structures negatively affect people's lives, and the people most affected are women. Put simply, whenever we try and affect social change, either as leaders, as practitioners, or social activists, there is often pushback. And as I was preparing to speak today, I was reminded of something that an interview participant once said to me, and that is, whenever patriarchy is threatened, patriarchy fights back. We are also fighting back. Gender washing is our way to help people to try and overcome injustice so that more people in the world can live their best lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. You've taken that baseball and that pitch well. And so thank you very much. We're going to shift gears just a tad bit, and I'll turn the floor over to you, Valerie, to talk a little bit about the point that this book covers different contexts in industries, but there's a lot on higher education or the university sector. Why is that?
Thank you very much, Dionne, and hello to everyone. It's great to see so many people from so many different countries here today. So there is a lot in our book in the HE context, and there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, as scholars and researchers, this is a sector that we have intimate knowledge of. So it's a known organizational context, and our researchers and scholars have knowledge of the organizational strategy, policies, practices in the sector, and can also gain access to employees and their lived experiences. So it is an ideal site to examine that disconnect between the rhetoric of gender equity and lived experience. And we do see that exemplified in a number of chapters. For example, the personal account offered by Emanuela Mandalaki that highlights the dissonance between scholarship norms and expectations and Emanuela's experience as a feminist academic. The second point that I wanted to raise is that the higher education sector is a significant global employer. It's diverse, it's multifaceted, and it has a very rich and complex history that reflects the dynamics of gender equity and inequity over time. And so this sector enables interrogation of the unfolding dynamics of gender washing in societal contexts, societal and cultural contexts. So, for example, Paige Haber-Curran, Adrian Bitton, and Natasha Turman take an intersectional lens to examine how growth in affinity groups in the US that are employed to address gender equity instead serve to inhibit equity and further marginalize those who are already experiencing marginalization. And another example is Sharon Maven's chapter. Sharon interrogates historically elitist and patriarchal UK universities to reveal a disjoint between a public commitment to gender equity and women's experiences of challenging gender-based violence. But we also have an example from Pakistan, a very different cultural context. Here, Saida Tuba Javed, Rita Gardiner, and Casey Egan's chapter is set within the Pakistani HE context to reveal how policy guidelines against sexual harassment represent an organisational form of rhetorical gender washing rather than an attempt to effect structural change. So we can see here how research conducted in these settings has relevance and resonance, perhaps for many sectors in different cultural and societal contexts. But I did want to raise a couple of other things, if I may, as well. The HE sector is focused on knowledge production and innovation, and as such, it has multiple stakeholders, including government, employers, business and industry, and it's connected and contributes to national and international think tanks and policy making. So what happens in higher education has relevance and influence on fundamental aspects of organisation, leadership and society. And HE being positioned as knowledge leaders has, as a sector, has responsibility, therefore, for acting ethically. So it's important it's held to account for its behaviours and standards. And we see this in Lisa Howe, Walsh, Victoria Pagan and Susan Kirk's chapter, which examines the importance of HE influence on attitudes to gender with specific reference to business schools and accrediting agencies. So finally, I'd like to say that the higher education sector is responsible for educating our current and future workforce, including our future leaders and managers. So it's not only a rich site in which to illuminate gender washing processes and dynamics, but it's also an essential sector to interrogate and hold to account if we're going to achieve the lasting and sustainable societal change that we desire.
Excellent. Thank you, Valerie. As I've surveyed the responses in the chat and the backgrounds of the individuals who have joined, there are quite a few of our attendees who are affiliated with higher education. So your remarks, I believe, were spot on. So thank you, Valerie.
Thank you, Dionne.
All right, Carole, so your batter up here for you. We talked about, the next direction to go, and one of the areas that we felt important to highlight, and that is women in sports. And so, Carole, if you would, discuss how gender washing impacts women in sport. Can you tell us more about that topic?
Yes, thank you, Dionne. I certainly can, and it's a topic very close to my heart. And I'm going to focus specifically on Chapter 7, the patriarchal penalty, Gender Washing at Hockey Canada by Hayley Baker and Jennifer Chisholm. And as I speak about, say a bit more about this chapter and provide a broader context, I think we will all be able to recall similar techniques being used by different sporting bodies to try and wish away some of the practices that are misogynistic, sexist in a variety of sporting organizations across the world, in fact, and which continue to this day. So within the broader context of Hayley and Jennifer's topic, they also mention that there is a prevalence of gender-based violence in all sports, not just hockey. And this has thankfully gained attention in recent media and scholarship in North America, and I would say across the world as well. I was just listening to the radio this morning. They were talking about how the people are lining up to become the next president of the International Olympic Committee. And some of those candidates are arguing, using the gender line to position themselves as the best president of the IOC. So it will be interesting to keep an eye on that race for the presidency of the IOC as well over the next coming months. I was interested in speaking about this chapter, not just because of my own interest in sport and watching sport, but also because of my academic interests around gender, and recognizing that, women's sport is a lightning rod for misogyny and sexism, and it's in the public domain. We mustn't forget that it wasn't until 1972 that women were allowed to compete in the Boston Marathon, for example. And women's cycling, after a brief few years in the 1980s, when there was a women's version of the Tour de France, the most well-known, biggest cycling race in the world, road cycling race, which has been running for men for well over 100 years. After that brief couple of years in the 1980s when there was a women's version, it wasn't until 2022, so just a couple of years ago, that the Tour de France Femmes was relaunched. So this is just an indication of where women are in terms of sports. Clearly, we can watch women's sport much more than we can, but it's still relatively recent that women have had a public, been seen publicly playing sport. We can watch it on the TV now, but there's still a huge number of problems with the governing of women's sport, which Hayley and Jennifer talk about in their chapter. So just to talk a bit more about their chapter, Hayley and Jennifer explore the impacts of gender washing practices within Hockey Canada. And Hockey Canada is a national organisation that governs major and minor hockey leagues in Canada. And in 2018, there was a case involving allegations of sexual assault by members of the under-20 junior men's hockey team, which acted as a catalyst to expose Hockey Canada's organisational practice of silencing victims and covering up bad behaviour. So the chapter, Hayley and Jennifer in this chapter argue that Hockey Canada's response is an example of this superficial attempt really to address sexual violence within the organisation, which fails to create structural change or disrupt ingrained power dynamics. And the chapter explores the impacts of gender washing practices within Hockey Canada. By considering the actions and claims put forward by Hockey Canada because of this case, Hayley and Jennifer in their chapter seek to examine how organisational norms and structures perpetuate a particular culture that does not offer meaningful attempts to address gender-based violence and instead perpetuates the myth of gender equality. So again, we can see this theme emerging in the chapters that Valerie discussed and the introduction that Wendy and Rita provided to the book more generally and more broadly in this concept of gender washing. So this is a very nice example of using that definition and working with it to expose and to understand in more depth how this happens, how gender washing occurs in this case in the context of Hockey Canada. And many of us, a lot of people in the call are based in North America and the US, and there's an example of the US women's gymnastics team a couple of years ago, and the heinous practices that were going on in that particular organisation. So just to finish off before we move on to the next stage of the webinar. So women are therefore not only subject to gender washing in sport, they remain excluded and less likely to participate in sport as well after puberty, and notifying and understanding why these practices happen can hopefully help us to avoid similar practices in the future and make sure that women of different ethnicities from different parts of the world are welcome in the world of sport. So I think that's all I wanted to say there, Dionne. Perhaps we can then pass on to the next stage.
All right, thank you so much, Carole. And you certainly shared it's clear you're passionate about this topic, and that came through. And so we will transition to our final question as a part of our sort of formal presentation dialogue component, and then we'll move into Q&A and open the floor for questions of the audience. And so you can actually begin to start thinking about your questions, and I'll cue you when to begin typing those questions in the Q&A portion. So colleagues, if you would I'd like for you to talk about, again, circling back to why is this book, this text important? And one of the things that we discussed in our earlier conversations is that this book is about a call to action, right? And so I'd like for you to address our discussion around how this is a call to action. And I'd like to hear from each of you. And I know we're going to pivot a little bit. I do think it would be relevant and pertinent to hear from each of you, to hear your perspectives. If you would integrate your reflections or position on a comment, and I think it's a great comment, and I appreciate Leslie Stein's comment here about the individuals who are represented here on the panel, even myself as the moderator. We are all women, right? And so as we talk about the call to action, what importance, or is there the importance of having a diversity of allies to be a part of this movement? And you know my position and is absolutely. And so if you would integrate and integrate it within your remarks about the call to action, the value of having a diverse allyship. Wendy?
Thank you, Dionne. Yes, that's a really, really interesting question. I'll come back to that in a minute. In terms of the call to action, we like to use, for those who are not from the UK, you won't know this phrase, but educate, agitate, and organise. This is the mantra of the Labour movement in the UK, of the unions movement in the UK, which is very much steeped in class politics. You know, that the workers in the US, it's such a great sleight of hand that the working class in the US are called the middle class. I mean, I've never seen anything so clever in my life. You know, immediately you think you're part of the middle class, and you are being exploited. So here we really do understand class war and class politics, and it links to the patriarchy. It links to racism. It's all the same process. It's that inequality. And so we argue educate, agitate, and organize. In terms of educate yourself first. And I want to say something about the leadership literature. I can see a lot of PhD students in this audience. Yay, I'm so glad you're there. You're doing work on leadership. Don't just rely on the business and management leadership literature, because business and management as a discipline is driven by the capitalist ideas. So you're thinking inside the box of discrimination, and just think about the management stuff that says, how can we get our workers to work harder? How can we get them to work harder for less? That's the discourse of the business management literature, unless you look at critical management, which is different. Carole and Val write a lot in critical management. But step outside of it. If you really want to understand gender and leadership, race and leadership, disability and leadership, LGBTQ plus issues and leadership, if you want to understand that, go to the literature around sociology, around social movements. How did those things happen? Why did they work? How did they work and why did they work? And you'll really begin to understand what the mechanisms are. Otherwise, what you're doing is it's very hard to write a PhD, full stop, right? Almost kills you. but then it's even harder if you're working on false knowledge. And there's a lot of false knowledge in the leadership literature. So, and you'll see a lot of fix the women or fix the blacks, really terrible stuff. So educate yourself and then educate others. Really important to educate others. So when people do come out with utter rubbish, well, women aren't getting promoted because their accounting skills aren't good enough. Their numerical skills aren't good enough. Oh gosh, I've had this argument at tables so many times. It's infuriating. No, the research says that as women, we're actually far better educated, far better qualified. Our performance levels are higher. it's infuriating. No, incompetent white men, incompetent straight white able-bodied men, very small group there, they're the ones that get promoted. Read around people like Hannah Arendt, and there's no better place to start than with Rita's stuff. It's fabulous. She writes on Hannah Arendt and gives you a nice window into Hannah's work, which is harder to read, but start with Rita's. Pierre Bourdieu, you can start with my papers, and that can lead you into Pierre Bourdieu, who talks about the social structures of society. Bell Hooks, Sarah Ahmed, read these people. These people will help you to understand. So don't just stick to the leadership, help you be more critical, actually, of the leadership and management literature. And then when it's safe for you to do so, agitate. So when you're in a room of people and they're saying awful things, and this is going to happen more and more now we have a new leader in America, when people are sitting there going, well, you know, women are naturally more caring, women are naturally weaker, women don't have natural leadership abilities, okay? Speak up, go, actually, the research doesn't say that, okay? Can I tell you about this? Have you read Margaret Mead's work on cultures and societies where women were the warriors and the leaders, and the men were the carers of the babies, okay? So agitate in terms of their thinking. And then organize, get together, support one another. And I'm going to hand over to who wants to talk more about organizing, because I know my other colleagues know more about organizing and have experiences of that.
I can just say something briefly, Wendy. I mean, it simply is organize as collectives. So form yourself into different types of collectives, and picking up on Dionne's point about the importance of allies from a range of backgrounds. So men allies are hugely important to have alongside as well. So the point there in terms of organize is just, yeah, think collectively, not individually. We can't address any of these issues, I would suggest, by ourselves as individuals. We've got to find our fellow travellers and work collectively alongside them.
And can I just speak to Leslie's comment before, you know, that everybody in this webinar, I don't know whether that's true, but it's, you know, names sound like they may be female. You know, we need to not just think about our male colleagues, but think about gender in a much broader way. And I would say that in the book, we have a fabulous chapter on issues to do with rainbow washing, right? That looks at how policies in Turkey and the Netherlands have affected the LGBTIQ community. But the other thing I want to say is, and I think this is so important, feminism is for everyone. I didn't come up with that, the late Bell Hooks did. And I think that this is something that our work is trying to do. I think it would be absolutely fantastic if there was a book on gender washing that was looking at masculinity, right? Because it's hard for all of us, right? This is why I said earlier, social justice, we need to think of everyone's best lives. But we also need to think about what is happening to women right now, right? And so that is our scholarship. But I hope that there's going to be new scholarship that builds on our work and takes it into very different directions. Thank you.
Well said, Rita. So colleagues, I'd like to move us into Q&A, and if we can advance the slide. And to open the floor for our audience to type in the chat box any questions that you might have. And I do have one as we begin to get these questions in. And this question is from Indira, and I apologize in advance if I've mispronounced your name. The question is, in what ways does the persistence of informal power networks and decision-making structures continue to undermine formal gender equality policies? And how can organizations address these hidden barriers to advancement? And any takers?
I'm happy to say something about that. That's such a great question. I think one of the things that we find, and certainly this comes up in the chapter by Paige, Adrian, and Natasha when they take an intersectional lens, about how often informal groupings like affinity groups spring up to look at to bring people together who may be representative of different groups. For example, you might get women's writing groups, that kind of thing. But one of the problems with that is often these groups are managed and the labour is done free of charge. And so the gender equality, gender equity work in organisations, we often find becomes women's work, because it's the people, the groups that are marginalised who end up doing the organising in order to advance gender or diversity initiatives. And typically that kind of work isn't always given a value or a workload attached to it. And so those are the kind of things that I think it's really important to address in organisations, and a tool like gender washing enables us to have those conversations in organisations to say, look, you know, you're saying here as leaders and as leadership team, we want to address gender equality, and it's great we've got people getting together, but all it's doing is keeping people together in those groups, and the people who are doing that work are not getting valued or paid to do that work. So I think gender washing enables us to address that kind of free labour, or the kind of work that is done informally but doesn't get valued or recognised. I hope that kind of answers or addresses the issues that were raised there.
Thank you so much, Valerie. We do have another question in the chat, and it's a two-part question from Amara. While researching this book, did other washings emerge? And how did this book handle the gender intersections in explaining gender washing?
So I can talk about rainbow washing, and you know, and yes, other washings did. Not just washings, but all sorts of contributors identified all sorts of interesting practices, and you'll come across all sorts of new language, gender spinning, for example, as well. So gender bleaching, another one. So you'll as you go through the book, you'll discover, because it's the first in that's looked at gender washing theory, and tried to define gender washing and spread and understand gender washing. There's some really creative work in there, actually, in terms of casting the net wide and being creative in the way we look at these things. And as Rita said earlier on, we've got people from all over the globe contributing and from different disciplines. And we deliberately did that to make sure that we were, setting a nice base from which to launch a slew of fascinating research. And one was a couple of colleagues from Turkey who, I have to mention Mustafa Özbilgin. Fabulous work. He's written on Pierre Bourdieu. Wonderful work that he does around discrimination, and looks at gender in the wider sense. He's a man looking at gender from that perspective. And they highlighted two processes: rainbow washing, which is again a sleight of hand, which is where an organization will take on the cause and of gay rights or of the LGBTQ community, to make it look like it's a good place to work, an ethical place. So getting on the back of that to access that community itself, sometimes to sell things to that community, or sometimes to just, do that virtue signaling to the greater audience of how wonderful they are. But actually the people in that organization who identify as LGBT LGBTQ plus, it's still dreadful. It's the same old, awful treatment, not getting promoted. And they also identified rainbow burning. And I want to talk about this because this is going to become even worse now we have extreme right-wing leaders, not just in the US. I mean, the US is the most powerful country, so it's very scary. But across the world, we've seen this shift to the right. And rainbow burning is what our leaders use to deflect from attention from economic, social and political decline. They point at another group. And if anyone's read Machiavelli, classic work this is, okay? So here I am, I'm causing you lots of damage. You white working class people of America, your wages are going down, you can't afford gas, all those awful things are happening. It's the gays, you know, or it's the immigrants, okay? And Mustafa and Sihat talk about specifically about rainbow burning, where we burn people of LGBTQ within that community identity in order to deflect from what the real issue is. So yes, there are other washings. Have I answered that?
You did, absolutely. And I'm monitoring the chat, and there's lots of discussion. So colleagues, I'm gonna combine a question, and I'm gonna include a couple of parts to it. And if I can get you, each of you, and whomever feels the most comfortable to address those points, please do so. So we've got a comment related to, has there been any research on gender washing in the global South? And I'm going to go up to something that's related to that in terms of research on how gender implicit bias fuels imposter syndrome. So there's some connective tissue there. And then the other point here, gender is a dynamic practice of distinguishing women and men and between female and male, which is influenced by implicit power processes. So any comments related to my packaging those points to your from your perspective, and colleagues out there, I know I think we've activated the emojis, and so there have been some amens that folks have been trying to raise hands as each of you have offered your comments. So thoughts on those points. So I think Carole, you had raised your hand, and then I'll go to Rita.
I didn't mean to raise my hand, but I'm happy to give it a go. I'm not aware of, going back to the question about gender washing in the global South. I'm not aware of anything, but that doesn't mean that it isn't there. I'm certainly not, it's difficult to keep up with everything, but Wendy and Rita might want to, or Valerie might want to.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that,
yeah,
please,
because
I'm really pleased this question came up, because one of the things that I was thinking about when we were going through the proposal stage of this book is exactly that. Here we have yet another, notion, theory, concept from the global North. How might it travel in the global South? And that, in a way, started my early conversations with Tuba Javid, thinking about how policy implementation happens in Pakistan, and how different and how similar it is in some ways to what happens in Canada. The other person who looks in a way at the global South is Rosie Walters, and her work looks at how, like these major corporate campaigns, often like what they're saying and what they're doing in the global South is really different. I know that Rosie is writing a book on this area, so anyone who is interested in international approaches to gender washing may really want to check out her work, because it's really good. The other thing someone said was about imposter syndrome. Not exactly about imposter syndrome, but there is a wonderful chapter by Gilay Dabibi, who looks at how discourses like talent management affect us in the workplace, right? Where there are some people who are perceived as stars and the rest of us are seen to be workhorses. And this is a problem. How on earth can you do EDI or DIE policies, as they're called in the States, when you have these discourses which are saying, well, some people are much better than the rest of us, right? We need to really unpack these discourses because they certainly don't help with imposter syndrome.
Wow, wow, colleagues, thank you. So I've got a couple of comments and questions in another area of our webinar, and so I will try to summarize most of this so that I address all that is listed here. So authenticity within the leadership context and gender washing, what are the linkages? And I think many of you can speak to that in a moment. A question about, let's see here, again, authenticity, and then critical masculinity and leadership studies. And this individual examines how critically aware men navigate leadership for gender equality. And so there's reference to Wendy, your work or your point about false knowledge in management science, which resonates with Louise. I often face challenges justifying why this research is necessary and am frequently asked to cite literature. How can I address this effectively? And Wendy,
Yeah,
maybe that could be directed to you or Carole. Okay.
Well, I'll just jump in because I feel your pain, Louise. And yeah, and I assume from that you're taking a qualitative orientation by the nature of your comment. One book I'd really like to recommend that might be helpful is Paul Hibbert's How to Be a Reflexive Researcher. That would be a good book to read. And a lot of Anne Cunliffe's work, whilst she doesn't focus on masculinity and leadership, she talks about writing differently. And the Gender Work and Organisation Journal, which you may well be interested, you probably know it, there has been up until relatively recently a writing differently section. So there may be sort of some areas of inspiration for you there. But I know within certain schools, within certain groups, communities of scholars, as a qualitative researcher who's interpretivist, which I'm making this assumption by your comment, so apologies if that's not the case. I know it's tricky, and all of us on this call have faced that and continue to face that. So that's just a point about that before others may want to respond as well.
Carole,
Yeah, Carole forgot. Sorry, Carole forgot to mention actually that she's written a book on handbook on gender and research. So that's a great place to go. Edited a book on that. So that's really, really good. Oh my gosh, do we feel your pain? Every day we get this question. And this is part of why we, decided we need to talk about the myth of equality. Because, and it doesn't just come from men, it comes from women as well. But we've got equality. What are you moaning about? We're fine. It's okay. No, it's not okay. It's been washed. It looks okay. It's not okay. And so what you do need to do, what I've learned to do, is gather all the research and stats you can and keep them to hand in a nice little document, or create one. I actually created one because I had one colleague in particular who, when I was chair of the management department, was always having a go at me about it. And he was in accounting. So I squirreled off, this is what you do. I squirreled off and I got all the data on the discrimination, gender discrimination in accounting and moving up into leadership in accounting and finance in the state I was working in. It was the state of Utah. And I created a nice little document for him and said, here you are, here's some interesting information you might want. There was the hard evidence. Now, hard evidence will not win it with everyone. This was a fellow academic. It didn't change his mind, but there you go. But it did open the door for discussions, and it changed the minds of other people around that table. because you can say, no problem, I can email you that information. I can show you the stats. So do make sure, do your work behind the scenes, gather the information. And there are some great places, catalyst.org, it's a great place to get loads of stats on gender and gender issues. And I know we're short on time, so I'm going to shut up.
Great. We're actually just we're chatting about, just to reconfirm here. I think we are. So, colleagues, last comments. I'll give you just a snippet if anyone wishes to add any additional thoughts. Certainly, there's a lot of discussion and a lot of interest in this book. There is a lot of interest in women in leadership, in really the opportunities to recenter how women lead, and ensuring that we are not basing our research on old research that, frankly, the foundational research, which was really rooted in and based on the male perspective, the white male or Eurocentric perspective. And so I'm super excited about the possibilities of more individuals, regardless of your background, really troubling this notion of the existing literature on what leadership looks like, how it shows up, who should be seated, if you will, in certain roles, and let's trouble all of this. So, colleagues, last comments before I close our webinar.
I guess I'll just say something really briefly about authenticity, because it is something I've written quite a lot about, which is just, I would ask people who write and think and care about this area to really think about what it might mean to show up as authentic, right? It's not always a good thing, and it's not always possible due to one's identity. And so, as Dionne just said, we really have to trouble some of the major leadership literature, not just for critique's sake, but to ensure that it has a much more social justice aim.
Well said, Rita. Thank you, Rita. Thank you, Carole. Thank you, Valerie. And thank you, Wendy, for sharing your leadership perspectives today, and for an enlightening discussion on the topic of gender washing in leadership, power, policies, and politics. I have a couple of quick reminders. If you've been following the chat box, we've been placing a couple of really key resources in the chat. We've had a question about where to purchase the book, and there's a link to a 30%, I believe, discount. So if you will, look for that. If you are interested in following up with or connecting with any of our editors of this particular book, please look for their LinkedIn URLs. I believe that has been posted as well. I'm also pleased to announce, and I did not share this in my opening remarks, the Gender Washing in Leadership text is a part of a broader series on transformative women leaders. And we are so proud of this series, and the text that is the focus of today's webinar is the very first book out of our series. And the second one that is in press is Women Embodied Leaders, Peace Building, Protest, and Professions. And so we are inviting those of you who wish or are interested in submitting a proposal, please scan the QR code here, which you'll find more information about this series, and as well as where to submit your proposal. Next slide. The other update that I'd like to share with you, as a part of the Women in Leadership member community, we are proud to share that we have been hosting, I believe this will be our sixth topical conference, sixth or seventh topical conference in 2025. If you are interested in promoting your research around women in leadership and girls, we invite you to, again, scan this QR code to submit a proposal to join the ILA's Women in Leadership Conference, Embracing and Elevating Systems of Change, Transformative Thinking on Women in Leadership. Save the date here, June the 11th through the 13th in Claremont, California. Again, we invite you to join us for that session in that conference. Again, we thank each of you for participating in today's important webinar, and I anticipate we will have more as these books are published and other topics emerge concerning women in leadership. Thank you again. We look forward to your joining us for future sessions, and have a great day. Thank you. This concludes our webinar.